We are verifying everything as usual. Welcome to NycosRPG, and I am your host, Jonathan Albin, and we are going to be today talking about, as usual, our list of subjects here on the side, and we are talking about characters, and we are talking about players, and we are talking about the interaction between them. Yesterday's video was a description of role playing for the uninitiated, and in just such a fashion, today's show is going to be talking about what kind of things you can expect as a player in a role play game, and what that will mean not only to you but to the people that you are at the table with. Now, we are going to talk about who might be playing at your table and what kind of experience you might have with them. We're going to talk about the player archetypes, and this is going to cover or span, if you will, from the very beginner player, like yourself, perhaps, all the way up to the, old school grognard role player with veteran experience, like you, which end of the spectrum you're on. By the way, my buddy made this for me, and I always make sure to mention it. It's really cool. And do that. All right. So we're going to be talking about players in terms of archetypes. Now that word just means I'm grouping people together in a specific way to describe them. It doesn't mean that it's something that must be required. It certainly isn't a concept of leveling up or advancing as a player, but it is a list of the types of players you might run into. We're also going to talk about group dynamics, the idea of pulling people together and getting them to work together. This information might be useful in other ways. For example, if you are building a team in your employment, or if you've got a sporting team that you're trying to gather together and unify, or even if it's just your family that you're having issues with. The group dynamics stuff we're going to cover is going to be rather general in nature, but it's going to apply in particular to role play games. Then we're going to talk about the group payoffs, what it is that the players will be gaining from participation, and particularly how understanding the group dynamics, you can give a better payoff to the collective so they'll be able to see and identify when they've reached or achieved goals. Now, if you do notice, one of the things that I have added to the screen now is the box about building the community. And if you're on here with me live on Twitch, I'm looking for expansion of the community as a whole. So if you are a viewer of this on Twitch, you can become a member immediately to this community, obviously just by clicking the follow button down below. Or if you're on YouTube and you want to do this, subscribe to the channel so that way you'll get the updates on when I'm doing the presentations. And this is one of the group payoffs, is then you'll be part of the world of Nykos. And so, by the way, I forgot to mention it completely. Welcome to Nykos, everybody. If you haven't been to the world of Nykos, or you haven't been experiencing the joys of being part of this community, welcome, welcome, welcome. In addition to the group payoffs, there are going to be player payoffs, and that is the information that you as a player can gain from the experience. And in particular, tonight's player payoff, wow, don't say that too quickly together or you'll blur that really badly. The player payoff for tonight is that I am going to be announcing at the end how you can get a copy of the NycosRPG as a PDF. The first book is called Dark Shards, and it's the rule book for the fantasy rules and such. And so stay tuned to the end, and I'll go over how that can be your player payoff. Now, in the meantime, other player payoffs will include things on developing your character, and not only in-game but out-of-game, and I'll explain all that in a bit. Now, the key to all of this is creating a coherency communication, and by that I mean when you are dealing with a group of players or co-workers or whatever, creating the coherency communication means you're finding ways to share information in a smooth and efficient way that will draw more people together. In this environment on Twitch in particular, the process of gaining new associates or new followers is a challenge, because it is a national or international organization, and you can be a viewer or a participant wherever you can get access to Twitch. So that means that the audience capacity is virtually infinite, but the number of players that actually interact with you and communicate with you via chat or via the comments section is relatively small. So we need to build this coherency communication while we're small, so that as we get to larger and larger groups, that can be improved. Like, for example, I do live games. If you're interested, 2 days a week on Mondays and Tuesdays, you can join with us at Board Game Paradise in Redlands, California. I'll go more into that later as well. Alrighty, so who's playing at your table? Now, we've already talked, yesterday's episode talked about the fact that there is a storyteller, game master, dungeon master. There's 1,000 different terms. In NycosRPG, we refer to that person as the director, because he's not actually necessarily part of the team per se, but he is instead the person who is providing the direction for the group. And so the director and your participants are what you're going to be talking about. So we're going to be talking about the cadre of individuals that are sitting at the table. So to understand who you're playing with, obviously the first order of business is to gain names. And from my experience, it's easier to learn somebody's character name in a role-play game than to learn their actual name, because you'll be referring to them almost constantly in the play of the game in the character of their role. And so therefore you'll want to get an idea of what their character's name is. But that's not what I'm referring to when I say who's playing. What I'm going to be referring to are the player archetypes. And this concept, the archetype, again, is not, it's just specifically a way of describing the way a person plays. So the first person that would be at a role-playing table, especially if it's a brand new group or if you are the brand new person, there is going to be the new player. And a new player archetype literally is somebody who doesn't have any experience with this group, or at least with with this game, or particularly with this group. And the new player triggers, or the new player attributes, I suppose you would say, the first one is going to be curiosity. They don't know what they don't know. They're not familiar with the mechanism or with the rules or with the style of play that the storyteller, game master, brings to the table. They're going to be mystified. They're not going to have an understanding even of the social interaction mechanism. They are not even aware of how they become a part of that. And so as a new player, they are inquisitive. They're going to ask a lot of questions. They're going to be unsure of what they can and can't do. Those with any roleplay experience will have an edge, so to speak. But even with that, a new player in a new group will still be exhibiting this tendency to ask a lot of questions. And so there's a feeling when you're playing, especially if you have any experience, of being less than patient with these new players. And so it's important that instead of giving into that impatience, you recognize that the new player at the table has much to learn, and be as helpful and encouraging as you can be. In my experience, at all the tables I've ever played with, role players with experience of any sort are very much willing to be patient and have a lot of compassion for the new players. Within that new player group will also be those that are familiar with the rules but don't know how to express themselves, and so there's a learning curve there. And the new player is going to suffer from all of the foibles. The first obvious one, well, I'll get to that in a bit, but the idea is that they're new and they don't have any framework to push against. They don't have an experience pool to draw against. So beyond the new player, you have what I lovingly call the mutant players. And I'm not speaking of this in any kind of derogatory fashion. When I speak of mutant, Make sure I got my little angle kind of there. The mutant player is that person who is experiencing the game vicariously. They are not necessarily interested in the story, haven't got the idea of what a story is. They sometimes will hear a description and completely disregard anything that might be notifications or suggestions of what the boundaries are for that interaction. Or conversely, a mutant can also be somebody who is completely bonkers and all they want to do is experience the parameters of the world. I use the term mutant, and I use it lovingly, but a mutant can also be somebody who doesn't care about the concept of story. They are there to see what the framework, what the rules of the game are. It's not unlike a child that goes into a playground and then runs around the boundaries of the playground to see what the limits are, how far they can go from their point of origin, what they can collectively get away with. They are inquisitive about the parameters of the physicality of the world. How high can I jump? How far can I jump? How quickly can I move? What is the interaction going to be if I am abrupt or rude? How do I find out what those limits are? And so a person who in this state of what I'm calling mutant aren't really a bad thing. So please forbear the language. It's just a terminology that I use to describe it. And for you as a player, you're going to see people. Ooh, my autofocus went out of focus. Go. Hello. Star. Anyway, you can still hear me even if I'm fuzzy. The fuzziness doesn't matter, I suppose. There, I'm back in focus. Whew, I thought maybe I was going to be fuzzy for all night. This concept of being, therefore, a mutant is only referring to this inability to know what the boundaries are. Every player will at some point want to push the edges and see what those boundaries are. And in some fashions, they go through it aggressively, and it feels sort of as you're playing, you feel out of your element because they are completely out of theirs. But just realize that it's just something that it's a phase you pass through as you're going through role play. Game masters often find these players difficult to deal with because they tend to drag the story off the rails as well. So it's important to recognize as a player when you're at a table with someone like this that this is just going to be something that will eventually resolve itself. Other player types that you'll see at the table will be the note taker. And this is the person that wants to make sure they have every detail of whatever's going on recorded. And partially, this is a helpful thing because it makes sure that the players know they have a handle on all the nuances of what's going on so that they can perhaps pick up on the clues for the puzzles in the story or the challenges. It can also be for their own memory. Quite frankly, playing session after session can be rather challenging on tracking what has happened week over week or session after session. And in my case, during COVID, for example, I was running 9 sessions a week. And so since all the sessions were being played contemporaneously, they were all played in the same timeline over time. And therefore, they could also cross over physical locations. There were challenges in remembering who was where and what was going on, what the conversations were, and such. And so a note taker or collection of note takers, maybe your entire group is made of these, are great for that purpose. They keep the story on track and moving towards whatever the progressive goal is. The next kind of player you'll run into at the table will be the social person. And this is the player character and the person who endeavor to get to know at first everyone at the table, So they will ask a lot of questions about your play style, what your character brings to the table, what background information you might have on your character, what you have devised so far, where your objectives lie personally, and that kind of stuff. And the social person is going to be constantly wanting to engage with the non-player characters in the story. Sometimes the story is totally, the entire adventure can be totally set in a social environment where that communication is absolutely necessary. In other sessions and other times, that social person can be somewhat of a detriment because they don't necessarily want to move to a more physical condition. They don't want to go to the traditional combat section of a role play game. They want to try to talk their way out of it. And there's nothing wrong with that as a style. And if that ends up being your style, so be it. But just be aware that's also a stage or an advancement process through which you will go as a role player, because it will become fascinating to find out what the different people in a town might know. This can take, as I said, minutes or hours of gameplay. Maybe, weeks will be spent just trying to do the role play on that social level. But some people, that's where they live, and that's what they are trying to endeavor to do in their role play games as a player. Another is the pure strategist. This person is listening for the physical location, where the exits are, how many feet are between players and objects and other players, other characters, other personalities in the story. And so they're always constantly working towards the angle of, if we go to physical action, I want to know what everything is done, where everything is, so I can help my associate players to make the best out of the combat situation if it goes that far. Now, because of its very nature, most role play games have a physical dynamic that can fully occupy the game. You will have players whose total involvement is only on the strategy side, and the story won't be important to them. They won't necessarily be looking for what in that story is colorful or flavorful or necessary or dynamic. They're going to be looking for physical combat advantages and things like that. And that's, again, it's absolutely necessary part of the game. And if you or other players on the table are involved at that strategy level, that's awesome. It's a great place to be. And in certain cases, you'll have the entire table will be strategy and will completely shine any conversational aspects where they will deny the options or the opportunities for communication, but instead turn to the tactical and the strategic positioning on the tabletop. Beyond these types of archetypes, you'll also have the teacher, and what I mean by that is somebody who's already a veteran at the game, and their only way of interacting is for them to help you. They want to. There's what does it. It's my hands in front of the camera. Notice my hands. Freaks it out every time I do that. The teacher in a group can be a positive. They can be, especially if you're a new player, it's great to have somebody that wants to assist you in understanding the mechanics of the game. They want you to understand how the physics work. They want you to understand what the interaction looks like, and that there are, of course, downsides to having somebody who is a teacher all the time, just like there's a challenge for somebody being mutant all the time, in that a teacher all the time is going to be somewhat critical. They're going to be concerned with what you are doing on a turn-by-turn basis and be very, very focused on how accurately or properly you're playing in the game. And so the teaching aspect is important, but if just like in any case of these others, any one of them over much can be problematic. And if you have a group of teachers, a multitude of people who understand the game, and perhaps their understandings are different from one another, then the teaching issue can be problematic. Another archetype you will have is the, I guess you call it the sportsman, the person in the game that is trying to win. Granted, role play games by their very nature aren't intended to have a winner or a loser. There are opportunities within the game to have those who win or those who lose in certain character conditions. So, for example, if you are racing from one location to another, then yes, you could have a winner of that particular race, but it is not necessarily a winner of the game overall. But when I speak of the sportsman, I'm referring to someone who is trying his level best to acquire the most items, thinking that that might be how the game is rewarded. Perhaps they're looking for the most dynamic magical items. Maybe they're looking for the most challenging foe to defeat. There's a lot of different ways, but the point is that the sportsman is going to be focused on the competitive angle. And again, a competitor is a good thing. Somebody who wants to push the envelope is a good thing. But if you take that level of competition and make it inordinate, you cause difficulties. So at the table, you might have a teacher and a sportsman and perhaps a couple of new players, as well as maybe a mutant or two, depending on the size of your table, of course. Generally speaking, your roleplay groups are going to be somewhere between 4 players and 6 players, maybe 8 at the cap. At a table like the ones that I run, generally there's between 8 and 16 players at a time. So that does lead to needing to understand better the individual player archetypes that you're dealing with. The final archetype I want to talk a little bit about is I have discussed it in these ways before and it led to problems, so I'm going to try to change up the term a bit. I'm going to refer to an alien. And what I mean by an alien is a person who is themselves a game master or has been a game master in the past and who is trying to game the system. They're trying to listen carefully to what the storyteller is saying and then try to draw from that game master what is important to that storyteller so that they can either earn that game master's advocacy, in other words, put themselves in alignment with what the game master is trying to do and move the story along as efficiently as possible, or they are doing so in the form of a subterfuge. They're trying to derail the primary objective and supplant one that they have created on their own, even within the game framework. There's more to that than I can describe in this setting, but just realize there are some people there that have an agenda of their own that's outside of the game. And so having an awareness of that helps to get a handle on where the story as a whole is going and kind of keep the players collectively in a group. So now we're going to talk about group dynamics, because now we've talked about the individuals, but as a playing group, whether you call it the party or the adventurers, or as I do in my case, you name the group and they become identified with that title. Group dynamics of a role-playing ensemble are very important. This means figuring out how they communicate, which players are going to have perhaps a guidance role or a direction goal and an intention to do so that you're playing into what the group really wants and not just painting them all with a single brush. Group dynamics can be things like how much they talk over one another. Many people in a role-play game have excited opinions about literally everything that comes up, and they want to react to that. So the group dynamic is essential to keeping that in line with what the group is trying to accomplish. So if you're a game master and you've got a group of people in front of you and you've got one person who's clearly a mutant in nature, they're going to do reactionary things. Do you spend your time engaging that reactionary and therefore constantly feeding his objective? Or are you instead looking at it from the standpoint of what is optimal for the group? So generally, group dynamics come down in several different ways. One is that they play collectively. A collectivist group, when they play together, when a decision needs to be made, they basically step out of the role of the character for a moment and ask the group, are we doing this particular thing? Are we doing that particular thing? And knowing that that's what they're going to do helps them to explain to each other what's going on and keep the order, if you will. Some groups simply want to go around the table. First player, then second player, then third player, then fourth player, and just resolve the action in that order. That can be helpful because it makes less cacophony, less noise in the group, and the players will each get their say in what's going on. But it also is problematic because it doesn't necessarily follow the action in the game, and it perhaps can suspend disbelief in how the mechanism works. Second type of group beyond the collectivists, or even the orderists, I guess you'd call them, the people that go in order, are those that are intent on sequencing by speed. And by that I mean the things that happen quickly or in a short period of time, they wish to resolve earlier than the things that take a longer period of time. And this, again, sort of feels intentional, sort of feels right, because the quicker a person reacts or interacts, the sooner they are done with their resolution, then the sooner we can get back to the overall story and continue. But it's problematic because role-play games are not necessarily played at the speed of interaction. So, for example, if you have a adventuring group that's going through a town, and as they pass through these locations, they are acting, then a person who is, say, third or fourth in line may decide to go shopping, and that inside of one of the shops on the street as they're walking down. So their action is going to interfere with the flow, if you will, of the game, because they are not staying with the group per se. And this dynamic initiative-based system, mechanistically tied to the speed of action, can be a challenge. So it's important to speak in larger terms for the players so that the steps of action can be kept in a coherent fashion. So, for example, in that case, the group is moving down the road, and 2 or 3 want to go and do shopping. Then it's fine. That's fine to process. But then you simply say, okay, the rest of you, they're going shopping. What are you doing? And therefore, you resolve their actions quicker, even though their actions may take longer, because that gives us time to handle the short information pathway. Other means of group group dynamics is a group can be all individuals. They all want to do their own thing all the time. That often goes really well with the turn-based, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this methodology, and only becomes a challenge when 2 players are deciding to do the same thing, or more than one character is involved in a particular scene, which case those are then segmented off. But the group dynamic of playing individualistically can be problematic because that leads to people talking over each other. So generally, one of the other methods is preferred, although you could handle a group of individuals, but you'd have to kind of strong arm them to make sure they give enough time to each other player as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what this means in terms of payoffs. A group, when they are playing as a collective, have certain objectives that either the storyteller has devised for them or that they've chosen for themselves. And the group payoff would be the conclusion of said scene, said action. And as a new player coming into a group, The group payoffs are important. You need to listen to what their objectives are, because the things that you as a player hope or desire to do have to be integrated into what the collective wants to do. So the easiest way to do that is to understand the group payoffs. Now, there are other group payoffs. For example, if one player's action is going to benefit all the players, obviously the rest of the group is going to be favoring that decision-making process that led that direction. So if you have something you want to do to help the group, then that is fundamentally providing a group payoff. This is a way of positively reinforcing your position within the group, and for the group to be reinforced towards solving the objectives, playing to the story of the game master, so to speak. Other group payoffs can be the social interaction. I mentioned earlier an individual social player, but if you as a group start to be coherent and work together, there is a benefit to that, because it doesn't take as long to process turns. It doesn't take as much to express yourself, because others will understand what it is you are trying to do, because they also are trying to achieve those group objectives. So realize that that positive reinforcement not only comes from the other players, but that you are part of it as a player in the group. So individual player payoffs. These can range wildly, and generally speaking, if you went back through the groups, the mutant's objective is to do what he wants to do and get a result. Even if it's a knee-jerk reaction and he wants to drive the story off topic, he wants that payoff for himself. In a group that is story-based, a player payoff is when a piece of their action in a game triggers a collective payout of information, or they gain something that's going to be useful towards the group's goals. If the person is a note taker, an extensive amount of information dumped on them all at once is a powerful player payoff, because they're getting what they were looking for out of the story. They're getting a data dump, if you will, towards their objective of completing the tasks at hand. If the character is deeds related, he wants to experience the victories in battle. He wants to engage and explore that. If it's a social payoff, then if it's a social player, then that player wants to get acknowledged, integrated with, communicated with, information shared with them. They want to be a part of what that game has to offer for them. And of course, the player who is all about the story and wants to help teach others is going to look for opportunities to assist others. So their payoff is when a player founders or a situation doesn't go as planned, and their advice might be helpful. In these kind of ways, you can support and endeavor to help the other players by being open with when you need have a challenge and need assistance, because the teachers in the group are going to step out and try to help you. So realize that the player payoffs come from you as a player as well, because your interaction adds to the group dynamic and the collective goals that are set before them, and also in the overall social aspect of having fun. Because remember, this is all supposed to be a game. We're supposed to be being entertained collectively and individually, and the player payoff actually ultimately is a matter of character building. Now, I say this because most role-play games use a mechanism that the players accomplish certain goals in game and then collectively receive a pool of experience points or individual experience points by which they can advance their character. But when I speak of character building here, I'm also talking about things like understanding that in a group you need to speak one at a time so that you're not drowning each other out. You need to listen to what other engagements are so that you can get a feel for what the overall story is. You need to give time to the player that's confused so that they can be brought up to speed and catch on to what's going on. You need to assist when you can and remain silent when it's unhelpful for you to be over speaking. This also includes things like honesty. Uh, we have a video that I did recently on one of my rants, which is players continuously prevaricating or cheating, trying to find an edge in the roleplay system to get ahead. And character building is learning to live within the parameters of the rules that you have and not instead try to find shortcuts. Character building can also be the interaction between players, because the more you become a team and the more you understand each other's objectives, the more assistance you can be to other players within the game. And all of these lead to the group developing a character, a personality of the collectives. And this, I think, is one of the most powerful things that happens in roleplay. So if you're doing this comparison with a work environment, utilizing these same mentality options, you can build a better team by having your players operate as they are within it. If that makes any sense. Finally, as we're coming to the end here, I want to talk about coherency communication. And thank you, Senkaku, for the direct message. I will talk to you in a moment, but you're more than welcome to post into the chat as well, and I can respond to those on air. But creating coherency communication is when the group's ability to convey information becomes collectively useful. In other words, a player gives his opinion on what should be done, the collective assembles all those opinions, and then the collective group decides what they are going to do. And this is really important. The way this coherency communication is created is by communication by the individuals who are playing the game to the other players within the game or without the game in order to connect them. And so this coherency communication also includes the player's game vocabulary. And as a new player, you're not going to have an established vocabulary, but over time you'll pick up terminology and understand what is being meant by different phrases and times in the conversation, that they are appropriate and when they are not. So therefore, with all of that in mind, realize that the objective of a role-play game is the advancement of the characters, advancement of the story, and advancement of the players on their own personal courses. And so with all this information, now you can start to look at the first question I asked, which is, who's playing at your table? If you are not yet at a role-playing table, I invite you to my games groups. I have 2 live games at the Games Paradise store in Redlands, California, on Mondays and Tuesdays at 6 p.m. If you're not local to Southern California, I do have a group that's open for my Patreon members. So if you go to patreon.com/Nykos, NYCOS, like the name up there points. That's a joke. If it's go to patreon.com/Nykos and become a patron member, then you're eligible to play in our Sunday group. And that group is played 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. on Sunday afternoons. And then ultimately, if you don't have a game near you, you can also check out any of the local game stores and find a schedule nearby. Or, of course, you can do the additional that I would recommend is go to startplaying.games. And at startplaying.games, there are a host of game masters, including myself, who will host games for you. And there's almost always some fee involved in that game, but the listing shows you what the game master charges, what events he currently has scheduled, what options you have, and gives you a place to open discourse with them. If you're a new game master and you haven't gotten involved, PM me and I can get you the information on how to become a game master on that site, and we can converse about that. So, having said all of that, I have reached the end of the official period of time. Senkaku, if you'd like to talk to me, feel free to post in the chat, or you can respond to the message that you already sent me. I do not tend to respond to private messages during a show, so I will be on the air for another 2 or 3 minutes in case somebody does have a question. Otherwise, I will be concluding this episode. So at this point, it appears, Senkaku, that you are my only viewer, and I haven't responded from you. I do want you to know that we are having a drive to build our community. So if you've not yet subscribed, click on the subscribe button on this channel, twitch.tv/NycosRPG, and subscribe. And that's all I'm going to have to say for today's episode. Thank you again so much for your participation. Thank you for your commentary, Senkaku, that was only in private message. And I will see all of you next time.